I'm the type who finds peace on nighttime drives. The darkness, the empty streets, and the stillness of the sleeping world bring me a sense of calm. It feels as if the world stops just for me, offering space to think, reflect, and enjoy solitude. The night started like any other as I was driving home from a friend's house. It was a half-hour journey, winding through back roads and wooded areas. Normally, it's a peaceful drive where I can roll down the windows, let the cool night air drift in, accompanied only by the hum of the engine and the distant chirping of crickets. But that night, something felt off. The road was eerily quiet, even for that hour. No headlights behind me, no oncoming cars, just me, the road, and the dark trees crowding the sides, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. A sliver of moon shone down, casting a pale light, but it barely touched the shadows. As I drove deeper into the forested road, the trees seemed to press closer, closing in. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, a gut feeling warning me that something wasn't right. I brushed it off as nerves or just the eeriness of the night. But then, I heard it. At first I thought it was just my imagination, maybe the wind stirring the leaves or the creak of a branch. But then it came again, sharper this time, a scream, high-pitched and desperate, slicing through the silence like a blade. My heart jumped, and I slowed down, straining to listen. The scream echoed again, a woman's voice full of terror and agony, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. I pulled over, my mind racing. Should I investigate? Call the police? Every instinct urged me to leave, but a stronger, perhaps more reckless urge compelled me to help. What if someone was in serious trouble? What if she needed help? Grabbing my phone and flashlight, I stepped out of the car, feeling the chill of the night air. The forest was dark, shadows from the trees stretching across the ground. The scream was faint now, but unmistakable, coming from somewhere deep in the trees. I hesitated at the edge of the road, heart pounding as I peered into the darkness. My mind screamed at me to turn around, get back in the car, and drive away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone needed help, so I ignored my better judgment and stepped into the woods. As I ventured deeper, the scream grew louder. I tried to follow the sound, my flashlight barely piercing the thick blackness around me. The trees were dense, their branches brushing against me like cold fingers, and the ground was rough, covered with fallen leaves and twigs that snapped underfoot. The farther I went, the more I questioned what I was doing. I wasn't a hero, just an ordinary person who liked quiet drives. What was I doing, wandering into the forest at night? But the scream drew me onward, leading me deeper. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence was overwhelming, somehow more frightening than the scream had been. I froze, my heart racing, and scanned the trees with my flashlight. But there was nothing. Just darkness and the oppressive stillness. A wave of cold fear washed over me. What if it was a trap? What if someone was luring me into the woods with sinister intentions? My mind spun with horrifying scenarios, each worse than the last. I could feel my pulse quickening, my hands shaking as I held the flashlight. Then, out of the silence, there was another sound, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. I strained to listen, turning slowly, and then I heard it clearly. It was behind me. I spun around, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. But there was nothing, only trees and shadows. Yet the whisper continued, closer now, brushing against my ear like a cold breath. "Help me," the voice murmured, soft and pleading. A chill ran down my spine. It was the same voice that had screamed, but now it sounded different, less frantic and more intentional, as if trying to draw me closer. The tranquility of my night drive was gone, replaced by a deep sense of dread. I was no longer in control, no longer enjoying solitude. Now I felt trapped in a nightmare, a dark, twisted version of the peace I'd sought. I began to back away, instincts telling me to run, to escape before it was too late. But the voice followed, growing louder, more urgent. "Help me," it urged. Though I couldn't see her, I felt her presence, close and menacing. My flashlight flickered, and for a second I thought I saw a shadowy figure at the edge of the light. But when I focused, it was gone. The whisper became sharper, demanding, "Help me." My blood ran cold as I felt a chill on my neck, sending shivers down my spine. I turned and ran, stumbling over roots and branches, desperate to get back to my car. But the voice stayed with me, hissing in my ear, each word dripping with malice. "Help me. I need you." Breaking through the trees, I saw the road and my car just ahead. But the voice was closer now, the icy breath brushing my skin. "Help me, or you'll never leave." I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking as I tried to unlock the door. Finally, I managed to open it, diving inside and locking the doors behind me. My heart pounded as I twisted the key in the ignition, praying for the engine to start. At first, it did nothing, and panic flared. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a figure at the edge of the woods, just out of the headlight's reach. It was a woman, or something that looked like one. Her face was hidden in shadows, but I felt her eyes on me, burning with rage and hatred. She began to move, gliding toward the car with unnatural speed. The engine roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the gas, tires screeching as I sped down the road. The figure vanished into the darkness, but her voice lingered, echoing in my mind. "Help me, or you'll never leave." I drove faster than ever, trees and shadows blurring past. The voice faded, replaced by the sound of the engine and my racing heart, but the fear didn't leave. A cold knot in my stomach stayed with me. I didn't stop until I reached my driveway. Finally, home. As I stepped inside and locked the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something dark and dangerous. I collapsed on the couch, my hands still trembling. Turning on the TV, I hoped for a distraction, something to drown out the fear. But the news made my dread even worse. A woman's body had been found in the woods, not far from where I had been. Details were sparse, but the reporter mentioned something that chilled me to the bone. She had been found alone, her face twisted in terror. The broadcast ended with a request for anyone with information to come forward. But I knew I wouldn't say a word. What could I tell them? That I'd heard her screams, ventured into the woods, and then ran when I felt her presence? No, I kept silent. But the fear never left, lurking at the edges of my mind, a dark whisper echoing, "Help me, or you'll regret it." I haven't driven that road since, and I never will. Yet sometimes, alone in the dark, I think I hear her voice again, faint and distant, calling me back. And deep down I know if I ever listen, if I ever return, I'll never leave. People often say I'm good at judging character and reading others. It's a skill I've developed over the years as a traveling salesman, driving from town to town, meeting strangers from all walks of life. I've had my fair share of strange encounters, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on the highway. It was late, around midnight, and I was on my way back from a business trip in a small town about 3 hours from home. The road was long and empty, stretching out into the dark night. The monotony of the road and the hum of the tires lulled me into a kind of trance. My only company was the occasional flicker of headlights from an oncoming car and the soft murmur of the radio, playing some old rock song I barely paid attention to. The night was calm, the sky clear, with a full moon casting a pale glow over the landscape. I was about halfway home when I saw him. A figure standing on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched in that universal gesture of desperation. He was a young man, probably in his early 20s, with a backpack slung over one shoulder and a look of weariness etched into his features. His clothes were dirty, his hair disheveled, and there was a shadow of stubble on his face. But what struck me most were his eyes, dark, sunken, with a haunted look that made me hesitate, but only for a moment. I wasn't in a hurry, and the road was deserted. Something in me, maybe a sense of pity, maybe just the desire to break the monotony of the drive, compelled me to pull over. "Where are you headed?" I asked as he approached the passenger side window. "Anywhere but here," he replied, his voice flat, emotionless. I should have taken that as a warning, but I didn't. I unlocked the door and he climbed in, tossing his backpack onto the floor between his feet. "Thanks," he muttered, barely looking at me. "No problem," I said, forcing a smile. "Rough night?" "You could say that." We drove in silence for a while, the only sound the steady hum of the engine and the faint crackle of the radio. The guy didn't say much, just stared out the window, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm on his knee. I tried to make small talk, asking him where he was from, where he was headed, but his answers were short and vague. "Just passing through," he'd say, or "nowhere in particular." Something about him made me uneasy, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way he avoided eye contact, or the way he seemed to flinch at every sound, every bump in the road. Or maybe it was the way he kept glancing in the side mirror as if expecting to see someone, or something, following us. I've picked up hitchhikers before, mostly college kids or drifters looking for a ride to the next town. They're usually talkative, grateful for the lift, eager to share their stories. But this guy, he was different. There was a tension about him, a kind of quiet intensity that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. It was late, I was tired, and the guy was probably just having a rough night. But the unease wouldn't go away. It gnawed at me, growing stronger with every mile. And then he started to talk. "It's funny, you know," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "How things can change so quickly. One minute you're fine, everything's normal, and the next, everything's different. Everything's wrong." There was something in his tone that sent a chill down my spine. I glanced at him, trying to read his expression, but he was facing the passenger window. "Yeah," I said, not knowing what else to say. "Life can be unpredictable." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Unpredictable. That's one way to put it." We lapsed into silence again. The tension in the car was thicker now. I could feel my pulse quickening, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. Something was wrong, very wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. And then he turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine. "You ever wonder what it's like to die?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to process what he just said. I forced a laugh, trying to keep the mood light, but my voice came out shaky, uncertain. "I guess I haven't really thought about it," I said, my mouth dry. He didn't respond right away, just kept staring at me with those dark, hollow eyes. And then, in a voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it, he said, "I have." My heart skipped a beat. I glanced at him, trying to gauge his mood, trying to figure out if he was messing with me or if he was serious. But his expression was unreadable, his face a mask of calm. "I've thought about it a lot," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "about how it would feel, what it would be like to just let go." The air in the car grew colder, the silence pressing in around us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my palms slick with sweat. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. All I knew was that I wanted him out of my car now. But before I could say anything, he spoke again. "I used to be like you," he said, his tone wistful. "Normal, happy, had a good job, a family, everything I could ever want. But then something happened, something that changed everything." I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "What happened?" He smiled, but it was an old, empty smile, devoid of any warmth. "I died." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying, but nothing made sense. Was he speaking metaphorically, or was he serious? I didn't have time to think before he continued. "It wasn't quick," he said, his voice growing softer, more distant. "It was slow, painful. I could feel everything, every moment, every sensation. The fear, the pain, the darkness. It was like being trapped in a nightmare you can't wake up from." I glanced at him, and for a split second I thought I saw something in his eyes, a flicker of pain, of fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that same cold, empty stare. "And then it was over," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. "And I was different. I wasn't the same person anymore. Something inside me had changed. Something dark, something wrong." My breath caught in my throat, my mind racing. This guy, whoever he was clearly disturbed. But there was something else, something in the way he spoke, in the way he looked at me, that made me believe he was telling the truth. And that terrified me. I wanted to stop the car, to pull over and tell him to get out. But I couldn't. My hands were frozen on the steering wheel, my body paralyzed by fear. All I could do was keep driving, the road stretching out before us. "You know what the worst part is?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. "The worst part is, you never really leave. You're stuck in that moment, that place, forever. And no matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try, you can't escape it." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. What do you mean?" He turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something in his expression. Desperation, fear, anger. "You can't escape," he said, his voice rising. No matter how fast you drive, no matter how far you go, it's always there, waiting for you, watching you, ready to take you back. The tension in the car was unbearable, the air thick with fear and uncertainty. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to get out of this situation. All I knew was that I needed to get away from him, now. But before I could say anything, he leaned in closer, his breath hot on my neck. "Do you want to know what it feels like?" he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "Do you want to know what it's like to die?" My breath caught in my throat, my body trembling with fear. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. All I could do was sit there, frozen in terror, as he reached out his hand, hovering just inches from my arm. And then, without warning, he started to laugh. It was a cold, empty laugh, devoid of any joy or humor. It sent shivers down my spine, made my blood run cold. I wanted to scream, to shove him out of the car, but I couldn't. I was trapped in this nightmare with no way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. He leaned back in his seat, his expression calm, almost serene. "Don't worry," he said, his voice soft, almost gentle. "It's not your time yet." I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. All I knew was that I needed to get out of this situation, fast. So I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed my foot on the gas, the car lurching forward, the engine roaring as we sped down the highway. I didn't look at him, didn't dare meet his gaze. I just focused on the road, on getting as far away from him as possible. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the lights of a small town up ahead. Without thinking, I pulled into a gas station, threw the car into park, and turned to tell him to get out. But he was gone. The passenger seat was empty, his backpack nowhere to be seen. It was as if he had never been there at all. For a moment I just sat there, my mind reeling, trying to process what had just happened. Had it all been a hallucination? A nightmare? Or had he been real? A ghost, a lost soul doomed to wander the highways forever? I don't know. And maybe I never will. But one thing's for sure, I'll never pick up a hitchhiker again. The night was cold, too cold for early autumn, which had been unusually mild up until then. My breath fogged up the windshield as I drove down that desolate highway. The truck's heater working overtime to keep the chill at bay. I had been driving for hours, my destination a remote cabin nestled in the mountains, a weekend getaway with some friends. The road was winding, stretching out like a dark ribbon through the dense forest, and I hadn't seen another car for miles. There was a certain comfort in the isolation, a sense that I was truly alone out here, away from the noise and bustle of the city. But as the road twisted and turned, that comfort began to wear thin, replaced by a growing sense of unease. It was the kind of road where the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, the headlights barely penetrating the thick veil of night. And that's when the truck started to overheat. At first, it was just a flicker on the dashboard, the temperature gauge creeping up into the red. I frowned, my grip tightening on the steering wheel as I glanced down. The needle was climbing steadily, a small warning that something was wrong. "Great," I muttered, glancing at the dashboard. The truck was old, but it had never given me much trouble before. I figured it was probably just the long drive, the strain of climbing the mountain roads in the cold. But as the temperature gauge continued to rise, I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I slowed the truck to a crawl, looking for a place to pull over. The road was narrow, flanked by thick trees on either side. Eventually, I found a small turnout, barely wide enough for the truck, and pulled over. The engine was hissing, steam billowing out from under the hood as I stepped out into the cold night air. The wind cut through my jacket, biting into my skin as I popped the hood and was greeted by a wave of heat. The engine was practically glowing, the metal shimmering with the intensity of the heat trapped beneath it. I grabbed a rag from the back of the truck and carefully twisted the radiator cap, releasing a plume of steam that rose into the night like a ghostly apparition. The smell of antifreeze was sharp in the air, a pungent reminder of the trouble I was in. I waited for the engine to cool, the minutes stretching out in the silence. The woods around me were unnervingly quiet, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest, but it clung to me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. After what felt like an eternity, I finally felt it was safe to top off the radiator. I reached for the jug of coolant I kept in the truck bed, but as I did, something caught my eye. A flash of movement in the trees. I froze, the coolant jug halfway to the radiator. My eyes scanned the tree line, but there was nothing there, just shadows and darkness, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, the isolation playing tricks on me. But as I poured the coolant into the radiator, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The kind of trouble I was in wasn't uncommon. Anyone who spent enough time on the road knows that breakdowns happen, usually at the most inconvenient times. I had been in situations like this before, stranded on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. But something about this felt different, more unsettling. Maybe it was the cold, or the darkness that seemed to press in on me from all sides, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. I finished topping off the radiator, my hands shaking slightly as I screwed the cap back on. I needed to get out of here. The truck was old, but it should hold together long enough to make it to the cabin. I slammed the hood shut, glancing nervously at the trees, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. Nothing. I climbed back into the truck, my breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The engine rumbled awake, but the sound did little to calm my nerves. I glanced at the temperature gauge, still in the red but holding steady. I needed to keep moving, to get out of this stretch of road and back onto the main highway. But as I pulled back onto the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Every so often, I would catch a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror, a shadow darting between the trees, too fast to be human. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline surging through my veins as I pressed down on the accelerator. The truck picked up speed, but the temperature gauge began to climb again, the engine straining against the cold. And then I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just inches from the figure. My heart leaped into my throat as I stared at the man standing in the road, illuminated by the headlights. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by a hood pulled low over his eyes. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the truck idling in the middle of the road. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Who was he? What was he doing out here, in the middle of nowhere, on a freezing night like this? And then he took a step forward, his hand reaching out toward the truck. My instincts screamed at me to hit the gas, to get out of there as fast as I could. I rolled down the window, just a crack, the cold air rushing in. "Do you need help?" I called out, my voice shaking. He didn't respond. He just stood there, his hand still outstretched, as if waiting for something. My mind raced with possibilities. Was he lost, hurt, or was this some kind of trap? The figure took another step forward, and I could see his face now, pale and drawn, his eyes hollow and lifeless. Something wasn't right. "I'm sorry," I muttered, rolling the window back up and putting the truck in gear. But before I could hit the gas, the man's hand slapped against the window, his face inches from the glass, his eyes locked onto mine. I felt a cold dread settle in my gut. There was something wrong with him, something inhuman. "Please," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "Help me." The plea sent a shiver down my spine. His voice was weak, desperate, but there was something else in it, something that set off every alarm in my head. I needed to get out of there now. I floored the gas pedal, the truck lurching forward, but the man didn't move. His hand scraped across the window, leaving a streak of dirt as the truck sped away. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him standing in the road, but he was gone. My heart pounded in my chest as I tore down the road, my eyes flicking between the mirror and the road ahead. The trees blurred past, the headlights cutting through the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The road twisted and turned, the truck straining to keep up with the steep inclines. The temperature gauge was back in the red, the engine making a terrible rattling sound. But I didn't care. I had to get as far away from that man as I could. But then I saw him again. He was standing at the edge of the road, just beyond the reach of the headlights. I swerved, nearly losing control of the truck as I sped past him. When I glanced in the mirror, he wasn't there. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop in the middle of the road. My heart was racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was losing it. There was no way he could have gotten there so fast. It didn't make any sense. But when I looked back, he was standing in the road, right behind the truck. Panic surged through me, and I hit the gas, the truck roaring to life. I didn't look back this time. I couldn't. The trees flew past, the road a blur as I raced to put as much distance between me and that man as possible. I drove for what felt like hours, the truck groaning under the strain, the temperature gauge maxed out, the engine on the verge of overheating, but I couldn't stop, not until I was sure I was far away from that man. Finally, I saw the lights of a small town up ahead, a welcome sight in the darkness. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, the truck sputtering to a halt as I cut the engine. I sat there for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing. I was never driving that road again, at least not at night. As I stepped out of the truck, I glanced back at the road. The trees loomed over the asphalt, their branches swaying in the wind. For a moment, I thought I saw something, a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But when I blinked, it was gone. I never found out who or what that man was, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to find out. Summer nights were perfect for late-night drives, something I had always loved. The cool air filtered through the open windows, the steady hum of the tires, and the way everything seemed to slow down made it all feel so peaceful. My girlfriend Natalie was less enthusiastic, but she indulged me on this particular night. We were winding down a dirt road that cut through the dense woods near her family's farmhouse. It was late, nearly midnight, and the road was empty. We hadn't seen another car for miles. The moon was a pale sliver in the sky, barely visible through the thick canopy of trees that loomed over us. The only light came from the headlights carving a path ahead. "Why do you always insist on these creepy back roads?" Natalie asked, her voice breaking the silence. She leaned back in her seat, arms crossed over her chest, her expression half amused, half annoyed. "Because they're peaceful," I replied, glancing at her with a grin. "And it's not creepy, it's just quiet." "It's creepy," she said, but there was a playful tone in her voice, like something out of a horror movie. I laughed, but I couldn't deny there was a certain eeriness to the place. The trees were so thick and the darkness so complete, it felt like we were driving through a tunnel. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for one car, and the underbrush on either side seemed to close in on us as if the forest were trying to swallow us whole. As we drove, the road twisted and turned, the gravel crunching under the tires. The headlights swept across the trees, casting long shadows that danced and flickered in the corners of my vision. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something. Just a shadow, I told myself, but it was enough to make me grip the steering wheel a little tighter. Natalie shifted in her seat, reaching over to turn down the radio. The music had been playing softly in the background, but now it felt out of place, too cheerful for the oppressive darkness surrounding us. "Let's just get to the cabin," she said, her voice quieter now, as if she didn't want to disturb the stillness. I nodded, focusing on the road ahead. We were about 20 minutes away from the farmhouse, a cozy little place Natalie's family had owned for years. We had spent many weekends there, hiking, fishing, just getting away from it all, but the road to the farmhouse was always the worst part. Long, winding, and completely isolated. We continued driving in silence, the only sound the rumble of the truck's engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing denser, the darkness deeper. I could feel the tension building in the air, a quiet unease settling over us like a heavy blanket. Then, out of nowhere, the truck's headlights caught something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just a tree or a large bush, but as we got closer, I realized it was a man standing perfectly still at the edge of the road, just beyond the reach of the headlights. He was wearing a dark jacket, the hood pulled up over his head, and he was standing so still I almost didn't believe he was real. "Did you see that?" Natalie whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yeah." I said, my heart starting to race. I saw him. I slowed the truck to a crawl, my eyes locked on the figure in the darkness. As we drew nearer, the man didn't move. He just stood there, watching us, his face hidden in the shadows. A shiver ran down my spine. Something about the way he stood there, so still and silent, made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. There was something wrong about him, something that made me want to slam on the gas and get the hell out of there. But instead, I did something stupid. I rolled down the window. "Hey!" I called out, my voice shaky. "Are you okay?" For a moment, there was no response. The man just stood there, his back to us. Then slowly, he turned his head towards us. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel them on me, cold and empty. "Let's go," Natalie said, her voice trembling. "Please, let's just go." I hesitated for a moment longer, something compelling me to stay to see what this man wanted, but the look on Natalie's face, the fear in her eyes, snapped me out of it. I nodded, rolling up the window and pressing down on the gas. The truck lurched forward, the headlights sweeping past the man as we sped down the road. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the middle of the road watching us leave. But he was gone. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. Who was that man? What was he doing out here in the middle of nowhere so late at night? And more importantly, where did he go? "I don't like this," Natalie said, breaking the silence. "Something's not right. That guy, he didn't feel normal." "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "But he's gone now. We're almost at the farmhouse. We'll be fine." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The road seemed to stretch on forever. The trees pressing in on us from all sides. The darkness was so complete, it felt like we were the only two people left in the world. The only light came from the truck's headlights, carving a path through the night. Then, just as I was starting to relax, something caught my eye, a flash of movement in the trees. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice tight. "See what?" Natalie replied, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "Something in the trees. I think it was that guy." Natalie's hand tightened on the armrest. "Are you sure?" "No," I admitted, "but we're not stopping to find out." We drove faster, the truck bouncing over the rough road, the trees blurring past. The darkness grew thicker and more oppressive. I kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that the man was out there somewhere watching us. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something, a shadow, a flash of movement. But when I looked, there was nothing there. It was like the woods were playing tricks on me, distorting reality, making me see things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just my imagination. There was something out there, something that shouldn't be. "Did you hear that?" Natalie asked suddenly, her voice barely a whisper. I strained my ears, listening. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the engine and the wind rushing past the windows. But then I heard it, a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. My grip tightened on the steering wheel, my heart racing. I glanced at Natalie, and the look on her face told me she heard it too. "Don't stop," she whispered. "Just keep driving." I nodded, pressing down on the gas. But no matter how fast we went, the sound seemed to follow us, growing louder, closer. Then out of nowhere, something darted across the road. I swerved, narrowly missing whatever it was, my heart leaping into my throat. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the man standing in the road, but there was nothing, just darkness. "Let's just get to the farmhouse," Natalie said, her voice trembling. "We'll be safe there." I didn't argue. I just kept driving, the truck roaring down the narrow road. The farmhouse wasn't far now. Just a few more minutes, and we'd be safe. But the fear gnawed at me, a cold, heavy weight in the pit of my stomach. We pulled into the driveway, the farmhouse's porch light a welcome sight in the darkness. I parked the truck, but neither of us moved. We just sat there, the engine idling, the silence pressing in around us. "Do you think he's still out there?" Natalie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we're not going to find out." We hurried inside, locking the door behind us. The house was warm and cozy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that we weren't alone. We spent the rest of the night huddled together on the couch, listening to the wind howling outside. Every creak, every rustle made my heart race, convinced that the man from the woods was out there, watching, waiting. But morning came and the sun rose and the fear slowly ebbed away. We never saw the man again, but the memory of that night stayed with us. Even now, whenever I drive that road, I can't help but glance into the woods, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me. But he's never there. If these stories gave you goosebumps, don't forget to hit that like button and share them with someone who enjoys a good thrill. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on so you don't miss our next spine-chilling tale. Have a creepy story of your own? Drop it in the comments. We might just feature it in an upcoming video. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.